The lieutenant's voice cracked across the marble lobby like a whip. I said get up. Now, you have 30 seconds to remove yourself from this building before I have you arrested. The old man on the wooden bench did not move. His eyes, pale blue and ancient, simply looked up at the young officer standing over him. What the lieutenant did not know, what no one in that lobby yet understood, was that the building they stood in bore the name of the man he was threatening to arrest. In exactly 15 minutes, his career would be over. First Lieutenant Bradley Ashworth had spotted the vagrant the moment he stepped out of his office on the second floor. A homeless man, weathered and gray, sitting on one of the wooden benches near the entrance as if he belonged there. As if Thorn Hall, a federal military installation, was some kind of shelter for the destitute. Ashworth had straightened his already immaculate uniform and descended the stairs with purpose. This was his building, his command, and he would not tolerate this kind of intrusion. The old man wore layers of mismatched clothing beneath a threadbare army field jacket, so faded it had lost all color. His white beard hung untrimmed against his chest, and his skin had weathered to dark leather from years of exposure to elements no person should have to endure. But his hands, Ashworth noticed with a flicker of unease he quickly suppressed. His hands were steady. They rested on his knees with an economy of stillness that seemed out of place on a man who looked like he had not eaten a proper meal in months. "This is a federal facility," Ashworth announced, his voice deliberately loud enough to carry to the two MPs stationed at the security desk. They looked up, watching. "Good. Let them see how a real officer handled situations like this. This is not a homeless shelter. You are trespassing on government property." The old man's response came soft, barely above a whisper, hoarse from what sounded like years of disuse. "With respect, sir, I only needed to warm up for a few minutes. I will leave when you ask." "I'm asking." Ashworth stepped closer, looming over the seated figure. "I'm ordering. Get up and get out, or I will have you arrested and processed. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." But the old man did not move. Not with defiance. Not with aggression. He simply sat there, those pale blue eyes looking up at Ashworth with something the lieutenant could not identify. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something else entirely, something that made Ashworth's jaw tighten with irritation. Outside, freezing rain hammered against the windows. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees, with wind chill pushing it below zero. The kind of cold that killed homeless men in their sleep. The kind of cold that turned flesh to frostbite in minutes. But Ashworth did not think about that. He thought about his building, his responsibility, his authority being challenged by a man who probably bought that faded field jacket at a surplus store for $5. The two MPs at the security desk exchanged glances. The younger one, a private first class barely out of training, kept looking between the confrontation and something on the wall behind him. A portrait. A photograph of a young soldier in dress uniform, medals gleaming on his chest. But Ashworth did not notice. He was too focused on the vagrant who dared to sit in his lobby. "Do you have any identification?" Ashworth demanded. "Any proof of who you are?" The old man's hand moved slowly toward the inside of his jacket. Ashworth tensed, his own hand dropping toward his sidearm. But all that emerged was a worn leather wallet held together with a rubber band. The old man opened it with careful, precise movements and produced a Virginia driver's license, so faded the photograph was barely visible. Ashworth snatched it from his hand and squinted at the name. "Thorn. Elias Thorn. Expired 4 years ago." He tossed it back dismissively. "This does not prove anything. This proves you are exactly what I thought you were. A vagrant. A trespasser." The name hung in the air between them. Thorn. The same name carved in granite above the entrance. The same name etched into the bronze plaque that every person who entered the building walked past. But Ashworth had never bothered to read that plaque. He had commanded this building for 8 months and never once wondered who it was named for or why. Behind the security desk, the young MP's face had gone pale. His eyes kept moving from the portrait on the wall to the old man on the bench. The same eyes. The same jawline beneath decades of weathering. The same way of holding perfectly still when addressed, as if standing at attention even while seated. Sir, the young MP said quietly. Sir, I think maybe we should. I did not ask for your input. Private. Ashworth did not turn around. He kept his eyes locked on the homeless man, on this Elias Thorne who shared a name with the building, but surely could not be the same person. That would be impossible. That would mean. The old man reached up slowly and adjusted something beneath his collar. Metal glinted in the fluorescent light. Dog tags. 2 sets of them, hanging on a chain, so worn it had polished itself smooth against his skin. Ashworth saw them and felt a fresh surge of contempt. Those tags, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Where did you get them? Let me guess. Same surplus store as the jacket? The old man did not answer. His hand simply fell away from the tags and returned to his knee. That same precise, economical movement. That same unsettling stillness. On the second floor, a light flickered on in an office window overlooking the lobby. Sergeant Major William Chun, 71 years old, former 173rd Airborne, had been working late reviewing security protocols when the commotion below caught his attention. He rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking down at the scene unfolding in the lobby. At the lieutenant standing over the homeless man. At the homeless man sitting motionless on the bench. Chen's hand began to tremble. He knew that posture. He knew those hands. He knew the way that man held himself even now, even after all these years, even beneath layers of poverty and neglect. He had seen that man carry wounded soldiers through enemy fire. He had felt those hands lift him when he was too weak to walk, had heard that voice telling him to hold on. Just hold on, help was coming. 57 years. 57 years since a 19-year-old private had been gut-shot on a hill in Vietnam. 57 years since Master Sergeant Elias Thorne had carried him 400 meters under fire to an evacuation helicopter. 57 years since Chun had watched that face disappear back into the jungle, going back for more wounded, always going back. Chen's legs were moving before his mind caught up, toward the stairs, toward the lobby, toward the man who had saved his life. But in that lobby, Lieutenant Ashworth knew none of this. He saw only a vagrant. Only a trespasser, only an obstacle to be removed from his building. He reached down and grabbed the old man's arm to haul him to his feet. And that was when everything began to unravel. The sleeve of the faded field jacket rode up. Beneath it, visible against weathered skin, was a tattoo. Coordinates in precise military notation. The insignia of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. A date, 11/1967. And below that, running in small script down toward the wrist, names. 17 names. The names of men who had died on a hill that would later be named for the soldier who held it alone for 19 hours. Ashworth stared at the tattoo, at the coordinates, at the names. Something cold began to spread through his chest. Something that felt like the first crack in a foundation he had built his entire identity upon. And on the wall behind the security desk, the portrait of a young master sergeant in dress uniform stared out at the lobby with the same pale blue eyes that now looked up at Lieutenant Ashworth. The same eyes, the same face. 57 years younger, but unmistakable. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open, and Sergeant Major William Chun stepped into the lobby, tears already forming in his eyes, a photograph clutched in his trembling hand. The photograph showed 2 soldiers. A young sergeant, an even younger private. The date written on the back in faded ink. November 1967. And the words that had saved Chen's life. Words he could still hear in his dreams. Hold on, son. Hold on. The cold in the lobby triggered it. Not the same cold as Dak 2, that had been wet jungle cold, monsoon cold, the kind that seeped into your bones while sweat still dripped down your back. But cold was cold, and the body remembered what the mind tried to forget. 57 years ago, on a hill that would later bear his name on maps that would later be classified, Elias Thorne had learned what cold could do to a man's hands, to his trigger finger, to his will to keep fighting when every part of him screamed to stop. November 1967. Hill 875. The Battle of Dak 2. He had been 35 years old then. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, already a veteran of 3 tours, already carrying enough ghosts to fill a cemetery. His platoon had been caught in a massive NVA assault, hundreds of enemy soldiers pouring down from the ridgeline like water through a broken dam. The position was overrun within the first hour. 143 wounded soldiers needed evacuation. The helicopters could not land under fire. Someone had to hold the hill long enough for the medevacs to get in and get out. Someone had to stay behind. Elias remembered the moment he made the decision. The wait time seemed to slow as he looked at the wounded men around him, at the young faces twisted with pain, at the boys who had trusted him to bring them home. He remembered the weight of his rifle in his hands, the familiar grip that had become an extension of his own body. He remembered the words that came out of his mouth without conscious thought. Someone has to hold this hill. Go, get them out. I will be here when you get back. They had argued. Of course they had argued. But there was no time for arguments, and Master Sergeant Thorne had a way of ending discussions with nothing more than a look. One by one, the able-bodied soldiers began carrying the wounded toward the extraction point. One by one, they disappeared into the jungle, leaving him alone on the hilltop with his rifle and his grenades and the knowledge that he would probably die there. But he had not been entirely alone. PFC David Leong, 19 years old, too wounded to evacuate, had refused to leave his sergeant. The boy had taken shrapnel to the gut, bleeding through the bandages they had wrapped around his midsection, too weak to walk but too stubborn to be carried. He had dragged himself behind a fallen log and propped his rifle against it, his young face pale but determined. I'm staying, Sarge. You need someone to watch your six. Elias had wanted to order him to go, had wanted to throw the boy over his shoulder and carry him to the helicopters himself. But there was no time. The first wave of NVA soldiers was already visible through the tree-line, and the battle for Hill 875 was about to begin. I will get you home, Elias had promised, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder. I swear it, David. I will get you home. The boy had smiled, that young, trusting smile that Elias would see in his nightmares for the rest of his life. I know you will, Sarge. I trust you. 11 hours later, David Leong died in Elias Thorne's arms. Blood loss too severe. Medics too far away. The boy's last words, whispered through lips already turning blue. Tell my mom I was brave, Sarge. Tell her I was brave. The lieutenant's voice cut through the memory like a blade. I asked you a question. What is your name? Elias blinked. The lobby of Thorne Hall swam back into focus. The cold fluorescent lights. The marble floors. The young officer standing over him with contempt written across his features. For a moment, Elias was not sure which was the dream and which was reality. The jungle or the lobby. The dying boy or the angry lieutenant. 57 years collapsed into a single heartbeat, and he was both men at once, the soldier and the vagrant, the hero and the failure. Thorne, he said quietly. His voice came out hoarse, barely audible. Elias Thorne. The lieutenant did not hear him clearly. Or perhaps he heard, but did not care. Either way, the name meant nothing to him. It was just a name, just another syllable from just another homeless man cluttering up his building. He continued his tirade, words washing over Elias like rain, meaningless and cold. Beneath his shirt, the dog tags pressed against his chest. 2 sets. His own, worn smooth by decades of contact with his skin, and David's, still carrying traces of the boy's blood in the grooves of the stamped letters, no matter how many times Elias had tried to clean them. He had promised to bring David home. He had failed, so he carried the boy with him instead. Every day, for 57 years, the weight of those tags a constant reminder of promises broken and lives lost. His fingers found the chain automatically, touching the metal through the fabric of his shirt. Beside the tags hung another weight. A wedding ring on a thin gold chain, worn smooth like everything else he carried. Margaret's ring, his wife of 52 years, dead now for 6 winters, buried in a cemetery he could not bring himself to visit. She had been a nurse at Walter Reed when they met. He was recovering from the wounds he had sustained at DAC 2, the shrapnel scars still fresh and angry across his body. She had seen through the hero's story to the broken man beneath. Had loved him anyway. had spent 52 years convincing him that surviving was not a betrayal of the dead. You carry them all, Elias, she had told him at the end, her hand thin and fragile in his, her voice barely a whisper. You carry them all. Let someone carry you now. But he could not. When she died, when the house went silent and her voice no longer filled the rooms they had shared, he found he could not stay, could not sit in her chair, could not sleep in their bed, could not answer the phone when their son Nathan called, day after day, leaving messages full of worry and love that Elias could not bear to hear. One morning, he had simply walked out. No note, no explanation, just his field jacket and his dog tags and the photograph of his daughters that he no longer had. He had walked until his feet bled, and then he had walked some more. 6 years of walking. 6 years of shelters and bridges and park benches. 6 years of believing he deserved nothing more than the cold. And now here he was, sitting in a building that bore his name, facing a young man who saw only a vagrant, only a failure, only a burden to be removed. The irony was not lost on him. It simply did not matter anymore. The lieutenant was still talking, still demanding, still performing his authority for the MPs at the desk and the civilians who had stopped to watch. Elias let the words flow past him. He had endured worse. He had endured things this boy could not imagine. A little contempt from a lieutenant who had never seen combat was nothing compared to the weight he already carried. But something was different now. Something had shifted in the lobby. Elias could feel it, the way he had always been able to feel when a situation was about to change. The young MP behind the desk kept looking at the wall, at the portrait, at something Elias could not see from where he sat. And somewhere above them, footsteps were approaching. Quick footsteps. Urgent footsteps. The footsteps of someone who had recognized something that the lieutenant had missed. Elias closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw David Liang's face. Young, trusting, brave to the end. Still here, brother, he whispered, so quietly that no one could hear. Still trying. And then the elevator doors opened, and a 70-year-old man stepped into the lobby with tears streaming down his face, and Elias Thorne's past came rushing forward to meet his present. Sergeant Major William Chun crossed the lobby floor with steps that grew faster with each stride. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hands shook so violently that he had to press the photograph against his chest to keep from dropping it. 57 years. 57 years since he had last seen that face. And now here it was, age beyond recognition to anyone who had not spent 5 decades looking for it in every crowd, in every shelter, in every veterans gathering where old soldiers came to remember. But Chun had never stopped looking, never stopped hoping. The man who saved his life had vanished after the war, had retreated into a quiet existence that Chun had only heard about in fragments. A wife, a son, a house somewhere in Virginia, and then nothing. Silence. As if Master Sergeant Elias Thorne had simply ceased to exist. Lieutenant Ashworth turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, his face twisting with irritation at the interruption. Sergeant Major, I have this situation under control. This vagrant was just leaving. Chun did not hear him. His eyes were locked on the old man sitting on the bench, on the pale blue eyes that had once burned with fierce determination on a hilltop in Vietnam, on the hands that had gripped his belt and dragged him through 400 meters of hell. Those hands were older now, weathered and worn, but they still held the same steadiness, the same quiet strength. Do you know who this is? Chen's voice came out strangled, barely recognizable as his own. Ashworth's jaw tightened. Some homeless man who wandered in from a cold. I already told you, Sergeant Major, I have this handled. Some homeless man. Chen repeated the words like they were poison on his tongue. Some homeless man. He took another step forward, then another, until he was standing directly in front of the bench. In front of the man he had spent 57 years trying to find. In front of the reason he was still alive to have a wife, children, grandchildren. In front of a legend. Elias looked up at him. Those pale blue eyes, clouded now with age and exhaustion, searched Chen's face. There was no recognition there. Not yet. Too many years. Too many faces. Too many soldiers he had carried off too many hills. Do I know you? Elias asked quietly. Chen's composure shattered. The tears he had been holding back spilled down his cheeks, cutting tracks through skin weathered by 7 decades of living. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph, holding it up with trembling hands. November 1967, he said. Hill, 875. Dak 2. Elias went still. His entire body seemed to freeze, every muscle locking into place. I was 19 years old, Chun continued, his voice breaking. Gut shot, bleeding out, too weak to walk. And you came through the smoke like something out of a dream. You said, hold on, son. Hold on. And then you picked me up. You carried me 400 meters under fire. You saved my life. The lobby had gone silent. The MPs at the desk stood frozen, watching. The civilians who had gathered to observe the confrontation held their breath. Even Ashworth had stopped talking, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the first flickers of dawning horror. Elias stared at the photograph. 2 soldiers, young and dirt-covered, standing in front of a helicopter. One of them was clearly himself, 57 years younger, his face lean and hard and marked with the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much death. The other was a boy, barely old enough to shave, grinning despite the bandages wrapped around his midsection. The private, Elias whispered. The gut-shot kid. Chun nodded, tears flowing freely now. You carried me out. You went back for others. You held that hill for 19 hours. Alone. Not alone. Elias's voice cracked on the word. David stayed with me. David Leong. He died in my arms. I know. Chen's hand reached out, hovering over Elias's shoulder, not quite touching. I know, Sergeant. We all know. Every man who made it off that hill knows what you did. What you sacrificed. Behind them, Ashworth's face had gone the color of old paper. His eyes kept moving from Chun to Elias to the portrait on the wall behind the security desk. The same face. The same eyes. 57 years apart, but unmistakable now that someone had forced him to look. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The young MP at the desk spoke into the silence, his voice hushed with awe. Sir, that is him. That is the man the building is named for. Every head in the lobby turned toward the bronze plaque visible through the glass entrance doors. Thorn Hall, dedicated 1985. In honor of Master Sergeant Elias Thorn, Medal of Honor. For valor above and beyond the call of duty. Battle of Dak 2, November 1967. Medal of Honor. The words seemed to echo through the marble space, bouncing off walls that had been built to honor the very man Ashworth had just tried to throw out into the freezing rain. Ashworth took a step backward. His face had shifted from confusion to something approaching panic. He looked at the old man on the bench, at the faded field jacket, at the dog tags hanging against his chest. He looked at his own polished uniform, his own gleaming brass, his own untested authority. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, how badly he had miscalculated. I did not know, he stammered. How was I supposed to know? He looks like a vagrant. He looks like... Chin turned on him with a fury that belied his 71 years. He looks like a man who gave everything for his country while you were still in diapers. He looks like a man who killed 47 enemy combatants in 19 hours to save 143 wounded soldiers. He looks like a hero, Lieutenant. And you tried to arrest him for seeking shelter from a storm that would have killed him. The words hung in the air like artillery shells waiting to fall. Ashworth's career, his reputation, his entire sense of self trembled on the edge of an abyss. But Elias was not looking at Ashworth. He was looking at Chun, at the photograph still clutched in those trembling hands, at the face of a 19-year-old boy who had grown into a 70-year-old man. A man who was alive because Elias had refused to leave him behind. You made it, Elias said softly. You made it home. Because of you, Sergeant. Chin's voice dropped to a whisper. Everything I have. My wife. My children. My grandchildren. All of it exists because you carry me off that hill. Elias closed his eyes. The weight of 57 years pressed down on his shoulders, heavier than any rucksack he had ever carried. 17 names tattooed on his arm. 17 men who had not made a home. But here, standing in front of him, was one who had. One life saved among so many lost. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. And somewhere above them, on the second floor, a phone began to ring in Colonel Vaughn's office. The installation commander reaching for the receiver, about to learn that a Medal of Honor recipient was sitting in her lobby, that the building's namesake had come home. The reckoning was about to begin. The ceremony had taken place in the East Room of the White House on a February morning in 1968. Elias remembered the weight of the medal before he felt it around his neck, remembered watching President Johnson's hands lift the pale blue ribbon from its case. The Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the nation could bestow, given for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. He had not wanted it. Standing there in his dress uniform, wounds still healing beneath the pressed fabric, Elias had felt nothing but shame. The citation was read aloud to the assembled dignitaries and press. Single-handedly defended a critical position for 19 hours. Killed an estimated 47 enemy combatants. Refused evacuation 3 times. Actions directly resulted in the successful extraction of 143 wounded soldiers. The words sounded like they belonged to someone else. Some other soldier. Some other man. Not the one who had held David Leong as the boy bled out, who had whispered promises he could not keep, who had watched the light fade from 19-year-old eyes while the jungle exploded around them. When they asked him to speak, Elias had stepped to the microphone and said only 7 words. This belongs to them, the ones who did not come home. He had never worn the medal again. Now, sitting on a wooden bench in a building that bore his name, Elias felt that same weight pressing down on him. Not the physical weight of bronze and ribbon, but the weight of what it represented. 17 names. 17 boys who had trusted him. 17 families who had received folded flags instead of living sons. Sergeant Major Chun was still standing before him, the photograph trembling in his hands. The lobby had filled with onlookers, soldiers and civilians alike, drawn by the commotion and held in place by the gravity of what they were witnessing. Lieutenant Ashworth had retreated several steps, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. But Elias saw none of them. He saw only the past. He saw Margaret on their wedding day, beautiful and white, her eyes bright with a future neither of them could have imagined. He saw her in the delivery room, exhausted but radiant, holding their son Nathan for the first time. He saw her at every holiday table, every birthday party, every quiet evening on the porch watching the sun go down. He saw her in the hospital bed, thin and pale, the cancer having taken everything but her voice. You carried them all, Elias. Her hand in his, so fragile he was afraid it would shatter. You carried them all. Let someone carry you now. He had tried. God help him, he had tried. But when she was gone, when the house went silent and her side of the bed stayed cold, he found that he could not breathe inside those walls. Every room held her ghost. Every photograph accused him of surviving when she had not. Nathan had called every day. His son, a JAG officer now, successful and strong, had left message after message on the answering machine Elias could not bring himself to check. Dad, please pick up. Dad, I'm worried about you. Dad, just let me know you are okay. But Elias was not okay. He had not been okay since November 1967. He had simply learned to hide it, to function, to pretend that the screaming in his head was not constant. Margaret had been the only one who knew, the only one who could quiet the noise. And when she died, the noise became unbearable. So he had walked away. He remembered the morning clearly. A Tuesday in January, 6 years ago. He had woken before dawn, as he always did, and lain in the empty bed staring at the ceiling. The silence was absolute, crushing. He had gotten up, put on his old field jacket, and walked out the front door. He had not locked it behind him. He had not left a note. He had simply started walking, and he had not stopped until his feet bled through his boots. 6 years of shelters and park benches. 6 years of soup kitchens and church basements. 6 years of watching his son's career from newspaper clippings he found in library trash cans. Nathan had made captain. Nathan had won a case that made national news. Nathan had gotten married to a woman Elias would never meet, might have grandchildren Elias would never hold. He had walked away from all of it because he did not deserve it, because surviving was a betrayal of the dead, because every morning he woke up was another morning David Leong did not. Another morning the 17 names on his arm remained silent in their graves. Margaret had understood. Margaret had spent 52 years trying to convince him otherwise. But Margaret was gone, and without her, the guilt had won. A hand touched his shoulder. Elias looked up. Chun was kneeling before him now, that weathered face close to his own, those eyes full of something Elias could not name. Compassion, perhaps, or recognition. The look of one survivor to another. "Sergeant," Chun said softly, "where have you been? We looked for you. After your wife passed, we looked everywhere." Elias shook his head slowly. "I cannot stay. Without her, I cannot stay. Your son is still looking." Chen's voice was gentle but insistent. He never stopped. He has been searching for 6 years. The words hit Elias like a physical blow. Nathan, his boy, still looking. After 6 years of silence, after 6 years of unanswered calls and empty holidays, his son was still looking for him. "He does not need me," Elias whispered. "He is better off without me." Chen's grip tightened on his shoulder. "That is not your choice to make, Sergeant. That is his." Wherever you're watching this story from today, we would love to know. Drop a comment and tell us your city or country. Stories of hidden heroes like this one happen everywhere. People whose quiet dignity hides decades of sacrifice. If this content moves you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories that honor those who served. Now let us continue. The lobby doors opened with a gust of frozen air. Colonel Patricia Vaughn strode through them, her face set in hard lines, her eyes scanning the scene before her. 2 tours in Afghanistan. A Bronze Star for valor. She knew what sacrifice looked like, and she knew what was standing in her lobby. Her gaze found Elias on the bench, found the dog tags, found the faded field jacket and the white beard and the pale blue eyes that had seen more death than anyone should ever have to witness. She came to attention and saluted. "Master Sergeant Thorne," she said, her voice carrying across the silent lobby. "It is an honor." And Elias Thorne, who had not been saluted in decades, who had spent 6 years believing he deserved nothing more than cold concrete and empty nights, felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen for a very long time. Colonel Vaughn held the salute for a long moment, her eyes never leaving the old man on the bench. Behind her, the lobby had transformed. Soldiers who had been passing through on their way to late shifts now stood at attention along the walls. Civilians had stepped back, creating a corridor of space between the entrance and the bench where Elias sat. The only sound was the freezing rain hammering against the windows and the distant hum of the heating system struggling against the cold. Elias did not return the salute. He could not. His hands remained on his knees, frozen in place by something deeper than muscle or bone. He had not been saluted in over 50 years, had not been recognized as anything other than a vagrant, a nuisance, a problem to be moved along. The gesture felt foreign, like a language he had once spoken fluently, but had long since forgotten. Colonel Vaughn lowered her hand slowly, her expression softening. "At ease, Master Sergeant. That is not an order, just a request from one soldier to another." She crossed the lobby with measured steps, her boots clicking against the marble floor. When she reached the bench, she did not tower over him as Ashworth had done. Instead, she lowered herself to one knee, bringing her eyes level with his. It was a gesture of respect that every person in the lobby understood. "I read your citation when I took command of this installation," she said quietly. "I have read it 3 times since. What you did at Dacta should be taught at every war college in the country." Elias shook his head slowly. "What I did was survive. That is all. No, Sergeant." Vaughn's voice was firm but kind. "What you did was hold a position alone for 19 hours against a force that outnumbered you 50 to 1. What you did was refuse evacuation 3 times, because there were still wounded men who needed those helicopters more than you did. What you did was carry the weight of 143 lives on your shoulders and bring them home. 17 did not come home. The words came out rough, scraped raw by decades of repetition. 17 of my men died on that hill, and 143 lived. Vaughn reached out and placed her hand over his, her grip warm and steady. 143 men went home to their families because of what you did. William Chun is standing right there because of what you did. He has children, grandchildren, an entire family tree that exists because you carried a gut-shot private 400 meters through enemy fire. Elias looked up at Chun, at the tears still streaming down that weathered face. 57 years. The boy he had saved was now an old man, older than Elias had been when he made the choice to stay behind on that hill. The mathematics of it staggered him. All those years, all those lives lived because he had refused to leave. But the 17, the name's on his arm. David Leong dying in his arms while he whispered useless promises. Those lives had not been lived. Those years had not happened. Those families had received folded flags and empty chairs at holiday tables. How do you weigh 143 against 17? How do you measure the worth of lives saved against lives lost? Elias had never found the answer. He had spent 57 years searching for it in the bottom of bottles, in the silence of empty rooms, in the faces of strangers who would never know what he had done or what it had cost him. Lieutenant Ashworth still stood near the security desk, his face ashen, his pristine uniform suddenly looking like a costume. He had not moved since Vaughn entered the lobby, had not spoken. The reality of what he had done, of who he had threatened to arrest, was written in every line of his body. Vaughn did not look at him. Not yet. Her attention remained fixed on Elias, on the man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. Master Sergeant, she said carefully, I have been informed that your son is a JAG officer stationed at Fort Bragg. Captain Nathan Thorne. Elias flinched at the name. His hand twitched beneath hers, an involuntary response to hearing his son mentioned aloud. He has been searching for you, Vaughn continued. For 6 years, he has filed missing persons reports, hired investigators, contacted every veterans organization in the country. He never stopped looking. The words were an echo of what Chun had said, but hearing them from a colonel, from someone with access to files and records and official channels, made them real in a way they had not been before. Nathan had not given up, had not moved on, had not accepted his father's disappearance as final. I left him. Elias's voice cracked on the words. I left him alone. After his mother died, I just walked away. Vaughn nodded slowly. You did, and I'm sure you had reasons that made sense to you at the time. But the question is not what you did 6 years ago. The question is what you're going to do now. The silence stretched between them. Elias could feel the weight of every eye in the lobby, the collective held breath of soldiers and civilians alike. They were all waiting for him, waiting to see what the hero of Dak 2, the man who had held a hill alone for 19 hours, would do when faced with the hardest battle of all. Coming home. I do not know if I can. The admission cost him more than any wound he had ever received. I do not know if I deserve to. Chun stepped forward, his voice rough with emotion. That is not your call, Sergeant. That is your son's call, and he has already made it. He wants you back. Vaughn squeezed his hand gently. I can make a phone call, Master Sergeant. Right now, I can tell your son where you are and that you're safe. But only if you give me permission. Elias closed his eyes. Behind his lids, he saw Margaret's face. Her smile on their wedding day. Her tears when Nathan was born. Her hand in his at the end, thin and fragile. Her voice barely a whisper. Let someone carry you now. He had been running for 6 years. Running for grief. Running from guilt. Running from a son who deserved better than a father who could not face his own reflection. But he was tired. So tired. And the building that bore his name was warm. And the soldiers around him were treating him with honor he had never sought. And somewhere in North Carolina his son was waiting for a phone call that might never come. Elias opened his eyes. He looked at Colonel Vaughn, at her steady gaze, at the phone already in her hand. Make the call, he said. And Vaughn nodded once, raised the phone to her ear, and began to dial. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Captain Thorne speaking. Elias heard his son's voice, and something inside him shattered. 6 years. 6 years since he had heard that voice in person. though he had listened to the answering machine messages so many times the tape had worn thin. "Dad, please pick up. Dad, I am worried about you. Dad, just let me know you are okay." He had never picked up, had never called back, had convinced himself that silence was kindness, that absence was a gift he was giving his son, the freedom to move on, the permission to forget. But Nathan had not forgotten. Nathan had not moved on. Nathan was still answering his phone on the first ring, still hoping that every unknown number might be the call he had been waiting 6 years to receive. "Captain Thorne, this is Colonel Patricia Vaughn at Fort Hamilton," Vaughn said, her voice steady and professional. "I'm calling about your father." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Elias could imagine his son's face, the color draining from it, the fear flooding in. After 6 years of searching, any call about his father could only mean one thing. A body found, a death confirmed, the end of hope. Is he alive? Nathan's voice cracked on the question. "He is alive, Captain." Vaughn glanced at Elias, her eyes gentle. "He is sitting right in front of me. He is safe." The sound that came through the phone speaker was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. It was something in between, something raw and broken and full of more emotion than words could contain. Elias felt it pierce through him like shrapnel, tearing through the walls he had built around his heart. "Where?" Nathan managed. "Where is he?" "Thorne Hall, our administrative building on post. He came in from the cold tonight, and—" Vaughn paused, choosing her words carefully. "And some of us recognized who he was." "Thorne Hall." Nathan repeated the name like he was tasting it. "The building named for him. He is in the building named for him." "Yes, Captain." Another silence. Then Nathan's voice came back, stronger now, the JAG officer taking control even as the sun fought to break through. "I am at Fort Bragg. It is a 7-hour drive. I can be there by morning." "Actually, Captain," Vaughn said, "there is a military transport leaving Bragg for McGuire in 45 minutes. I've already made a call. If you can get to the airfield, there will be a seat waiting for you. You could be here in 2 hours." Elias stared at Vaughn. She had made the call before she even asked him, before she knew he would say yes. She had looked at a homeless man on a bench and seen a father who needed to come home, and she had started moving heaven and earth to make it happen. "I will be on that plane." Nathan's voice was fierce now, determined. Tell him I am coming. Tell him not to leave." Vaughn lowered the phone and looked at Elias. "Your son is coming, Master Sergeant. 2 hours." Elias nodded slowly. The enormity of what was happening pressed down on him like a physical weight. In 2 hours, he would see his son for the first time in 6 years. Would have to look into Nathan's eyes and explain why he had walked away. Would have to face the damage he had done and hope that something could be salvaged from the wreckage. The lobby had grown even more crowded. Word had spread through the building, soldiers abandoning their late-night duties to come see the legend who had materialized in their midst. They lined the walls like an honor guard, young faces marked with awe and old faces marked with understanding. Some of them had seen combat. Some of them knew what it meant to carry the dead. Chen had not moved from Elias's side. The 70-year-old sergeant major stood like a sentinel, his presence a shield against anyone who might disturb the man who had saved his life. His hand rested on Elias's shoulder, a warm and steady weight. "Tell me about your son," Chen said quietly. "I never knew you had a family." Elias was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "Nathan was born in 1977, 10 years after DAC 2. Margaret and I had given up on having children by then. The doctor said her body had been through too much, the stress of waiting for me to come home, the years of not knowing if I was alive or dead. But Nathan came anyway, stubborn from the start, just like his mother." A ghost of a smile crossed Elias's face. The first smile anyone in that lobby had seen from him. He wanted to be a soldier. From the time he could walk, he wanted to follow in my footsteps. I told him no. Told him the army would chew him up and spit him out. Told him I had seen enough death for both of us. He joined ROTC anyway. Got his law degree. Became a JAG officer. Said if he could not fight like his father, he would make sure the ones who did had someone to protect their rights. Chen nodded slowly. "You sound like a good man." "He is." Elias's voice dropped to a whisper. "He is a better man than I ever was. And I left him. After everything Margaret and I went through to have him, after all the years of watching him grow, I just walked away. Grief makes us do terrible things, Sergeant. Elias shook his head. It was not just grief. It was guilt. Every time I looked at Nathan, I saw all the sons who never came home. All the boys I could not save. David Leong was 19 when he died. Nathan was older than that when I left. But in my mind, they were the same. Every young man I looked at was David. Every face was a reminder of my failure. You did not fail, Chen said firmly. You held that hill. You saved 143 men. David Leong died a hero, and he died knowing you were with him. That is not failure. That is war. The words hung in the air between them. Elias had heard variations of them before from therapists and chaplains and fellow veterans. He had never believed them. But hearing them from Chun, from a man who had been there, who had bled on that hill and survived because of what Elias had done, they carried a weight that could not be dismissed. Across the lobby, Lieutenant Ashworth still stood frozen near the security desk. His face had gone from ashen to something approaching green. The full scope of his mistake was becoming clearer with every passing minute. Every new soldier who entered the lobby and came to attention, every whispered conversation about Medal of Honor and DAC-2 in 19 hours alone. Colonel Vaughn finally turned her attention to him. Her voice was cold. Lieutenant Ashworth, my office, 0700 tomorrow morning. You are dismissed for the evening. Ashworth opened his mouth as if to speak, to explain, to justify. But there were no words that could undo what he had done. He closed his mouth, nodded once, and walked toward the exit with the stiff gait of a man marching to his own execution. The doors closed behind him. The cold rushed in for a moment, then dissipated, and Elias Thorne sat on the bench in the building that bore his name, surrounded by soldiers who honored him, waiting for the son he had abandoned to walk through those same doors. 2 hours. In 2 hours, everything would change. The first hour passed in fragments. Soldiers came and went, some simply standing at attention for a moment before returning to their duties, others lingering along the walls as if reluctant to leave. A young specialist brought coffee from somewhere, pressing a warm cup into Elias's hands with trembling fingers. A master sergeant who had served 3 tours in Iraq knelt briefly beside the bench and said only 2 words. Thank you. Then he was gone, disappearing back into the building's depths. Elias held the coffee, but did not drink it. The warmth seeped into his palms, into the bones that had been cold for so long he had forgotten what warmth felt like. He stared at the steam rising from the cup and tried to prepare himself for what was coming. Nathan would have questions. Nathan would want answers. Why did you leave? Where have you been? How would you do this to me? The questions were reasonable. They deserved honest responses. But Elias was not sure he had any answers that would make sense to anyone who had not lived inside his head for the past 6 years. How do you explain to your son that you left because staying felt like a betrayal? How do you tell him that every time you looked at his face, you saw the faces of dead boys? How do you admit that you ran because you were afraid that your presence would poison everything it touched? Colonel Vaughn had retreated to a respectful distance, speaking quietly into her phone, coordinating details that Elias did not try to follow. Chun remained beside him, a constant presence, occasionally sharing memories of the men they had both known, names that Elias had not spoken aloud in decades. Rodriguez, Thompson, Baker, Kimu, the roll call of the dead, recited like a prayer. Do you remember Corporal Williams? Chun asked. Big guy from Texas. Could not hit the broadside of a barn, but could carry 3 wounded men at once. Elias nodded slowly. He took shrapnel in the shoulder, covering our retreat. Kept moving anyway. Got 6 men to the helicopters before he collapsed. He made a home, Chin said. Lived until 2015. Had 4 kids and 11 grandchildren. I spoke at his funeral. The information settled into Elias like stones dropping into still water. Williams had made it. Another name to add to the column of survivors. Another life lived because of what they had done on that hill. But there were other names. Names that had no grandchildren. No funerals filled with family. Just stone markers in military cemeteries and fading photographs in boxes that no one opened anymore. Chen seemed to sense the direction of his thoughts. The living do not cancel out the dead, Sergeant. I know that. But the dead would not want us to stop living. David Leong would not want you sleeping under bridges. The 17 would not want you punishing yourself for surviving. You do not know that. I know what I would want. Chin's voice was fierce. If I had died on that hill, and you had lived, I would want you to go home to your wife. Raise your son. Live a life I could not live. That is what any of them would want. That is what soldiers want for each other. Elias closed his eyes. The faces swam before him. David's face, young and trusting. Margaret's face, beautiful and tired. Nathan's face, the last time he had seen it, standing in the doorway of the house asking if Dad was okay. I told him I was fine, Elias whispered, the morning before I left. He called and asked if I was okay, and I told him I was fine. Then I walked out and never came back. Chin was silent for a moment. Then he asked the question that Elias had been avoiding for 6 years. Why? Why that morning? Because I woke up and I could not remember her voice. Elias's own voice cracked on the words. Margaret. I woke up and I tried to hear her voice in my head, and it was gone. 52 years of marriage, and I could not remember what she sounded like. And I thought if I could forget her voice, I could forget anything. I could forget who I was. I could become someone else. Someone who did not carry all those names. So you left. So I left. Elias opened his eyes. The lobby swam back into focus. I thought if I disappeared, the memories would disappear too. But they did not. They followed me. Every shelter, every park bench, every cold night. They were always there. David, Margaret, the 17. They never left. The lobby doors opened and a gust of frozen air swept through. Elias tensed, but it was only a soldier returning from patrol, stomping snow from his boots. Not Nathan. Not yet. The clock on the wall showed 90 minutes had passed since Vaughn's phone call. 30 minutes left. 30 minutes until Elias would have to face his son and answer for 6 years of silence. He could still leave. The thought crept into his mind unbidden. He could stand up right now, walk out into the storm, disappear back into the anonymity that had protected him for so long. No one would stop him. Even Vaughn would not physically restrain a Medal of Honor recipient. He could be gone before Nathan arrived, could spare them both the painful confrontation that was coming. His legs tensed. His hands gripped the edge of the bench. Chin's hand came down on his shoulder. Do not, the sergeant major said quietly. Do not run. Not this time. He does not need to see what I have become. He needs to see that you are alive. Chin's grip tightened. He needs to see his father. Whatever you have become, whatever you think you are still his father. That does not disappear because you sleep in shelters instead of houses. Elias looked down at his hands. Weathered. Scarred. The hands of an old man who had lived too long and lost too much. These hands had carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, had held dying boys as they took their last breaths, had touched Margaret's face on their wedding day, and held Nathan when he was a newborn. These hands had also signed the discharge papers, had packed a rucksack, had opened the door and walked out without looking back. What if he cannot forgive me? Chin was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice soft. What if he already has? The words hung in the air. Elias turned them over in his mind, examining them from every angle. 6 years of searching. Private investigators. Missing persons reports. Every veterans organization in the country. Nathan had done all of that. Had spent 6 years refusing to give up. That was not the behavior of a son who could not forgive. That was the behavior of a son who had already forgiven and was simply waiting for his father to come home. Elias released his grip on the bench. His legs relaxed. The urge to run faded, replaced by something he had not felt in a very long time. Hope. And somewhere outside, growing closer with every passing minute, a military transport was descending through the freezing rain, carrying a son toward a father who had finally stopped running. The transport touched down at McGuire Air Force Base at 0137 hours. Captain Nathan Thorne was out of his seat before the wheels stopped rolling, his hand already reaching for the door release. The loadmaster tried to tell him to wait for the all-clear, but Nathan was not listening. He had waited 6 years. He would not wait another minute. A staff car was idling on the tarmac, arranged by Colonel Vaughn. Nathan threw himself into the back seat and gave the driver an address he had memorized years ago, back when he first learned that his father had been stationed at Fort Hamilton in the 1990s. Thorn Hall, the building they had named for a hero. The building where his father was waiting. The drive took 18 minutes through empty late-night streets. Nathan spent every one of those minutes staring out the window, watching the freezing rain streak across the glass, try to prepare himself for what he was about to see. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. In the first months after his father disappeared, Nathan had pictured finding him confused and disoriented, perhaps suffering from dementia or some other medical crisis. Later, as the months stretched into years, the imagined scenarios grew darker. His father in a hospital bed, his father in a morgue, his father's name on a list of unidentified remains. But never this. Never his father walking into a building that bore his name, seeking shelter from a storm, being recognized by soldiers who knew the legend even if they did not know the man. The poetry of it was almost too perfect to be real. The staff car pulled up to Thorn Hall at 0156 hours. Nathan was out before the vehicle fully stopped, his dress uniform collecting snowflakes as he strode toward the entrance. He paused for just a moment at the bronze plaque. Thorn Hall, dedicated 1985, in honor of Master Sergeant Elias Thorn, Medal of Honor. His father's name, his own name, carved in granite and bronze, permanent and proud. And somewhere inside, the man himself, no longer a legend but a father. His father. Nathan pushed through the doors. The lobby was filled with soldiers. They lined the walls, stood at attention near the security desk, clustered in small groups near the elevators. Every head turned when Nathan entered. Every eye tracked him as he moved forward, searching, scanning, looking for a face he had not seen in 6 years. And then he saw him. Elias Thorn sat on a wooden bench near the far wall, a paper cup of cold coffee still clutched in his hands. He looked smaller than Nathan remembered, thinner. The white beard aged him decades beyond his 78 years. The faded field jacket hung loose on shoulders that had once been broad and strong. But the eyes were the same, pale blue, ancient, carrying the weight of 1,000 memories. Those eyes found Nathan across the crowded lobby, and something in them shifted. Something that might have been fear. Something that might have been hope. Something that might have been both. Nathan's legs moved without conscious thought. His dress shoes clicked against the marble floor, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. Every soldier in the lobby had gone still, watching, bearing witness to a reunion decades in the making. He stopped 3 feet from the bench. His father looked up at him. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Nathan took in every detail. The hollowed cheeks, the trembling hands, the dog tags hanging against a chest that rose and fell with shallow breaths. His father was alive. After 6 years of wondering, of fearing the worst, of lying awake at night, imagining every terrible possibility, his father was alive. Dad. The word came out broken, cracked down the middle by 6 years of grief and hope and desperate searching. Elias's face crumpled. The stoic mask he had worn for decades, the armor that had protected him from feeling too much, shattered like glass. Tears spilled down weathered cheeks, cutting tracks through grime and years of neglect. Nathan. His voice was barely a whisper. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Nathan closed the distance between them in 2 steps. He dropped to his knees in front of the bench, his hands reaching out to grip his father's arms, to confirm that this was real, that he was not dreaming, that the man he had been searching for was finally here. Do not apologize. Nathan's voice was fierce, even as tears streamed down his own face. Do not you dare apologize. Just come home. That is all I want. Just come home. Elias shook his head slowly. You do not understand. I left you. After your mother died, I just left. I abandoned you. I know. Nathan's grip tightened. I know why you left. Mom told me you would. The words hit Elias like a physical blow. He stared at his son, confusion written across his features. What? Before she died. Nathan swallowed hard, fighting to keep his voice steady. She knew. She knew the guilt was eating you alive. She knew that without her there to hold you together, you would fall apart. She made me promise. Promise what? To find you. Nathan's voice broke completely. She made me promise to find you and bring you home. No matter how long it took. No matter where you went. She knew you would run, Dad. And she knew I would have to be the one to bring you back. Elias could not breathe. The air had been sucked out of the room, out of his lungs, out of the universe. Margaret had known. Of course she had known. 52 years of marriage. She had always known him better than he knew himself. She told me something else too. Nathan's hand moved to his father's face, cupping the weathered cheek like Elias used to do to him when he was a boy. She said to tell you that surviving is not betraying the dead. She said you would understand what that meant. The words were a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 6 years. Surviving is not betraying the dead. Margaret's words, delivered through their son, reaching across the void of death to touch him one more time. Elias broke. The sobs came from somewhere deep, somewhere he had sealed away decades ago. His body shook with the force of them, 6 years of grief and guilt and loneliness pouring out in waves that he could not control. Nathan pulled him forward, wrapping his arms around his father, holding him the way Elias used to hold Nathan when he was a child afraid of the dark. "I've got you, Dad." Nathan's voice was steady now, anchoring them both. "I have got you. You are coming home." Around them, the soldiers stood in silence. Some wiped their eyes. Others simply watched, bearing witness to a moment that would be spoken of in whispers for years to come. The night the hero of Dak came home. The night his son found his father in the building that bore their name. And Elias Thorne, Medal of Honor recipient, survivor of 19 hours alone on a hill in Vietnam. The man who had carried 143 wounded soldiers to safety finally let someone carry him. The embrace lasted for a long time. Neither man wanted to be the first to let go. Nathan held his father with the desperate grip of someone who had spent 6 years afraid he would never get this chance. And Elias clung to his son like a drowning man who had finally found solid ground. When they finally separated, Nathan kept his hands on his father's shoulders, studying the face he had not seen in so long. The changes were stark. The strong jaw hidden beneath an unkempt beard. The proud posture bent by years of sleeping on concrete. The clear eyes clouded by exhaustion and malnutrition. But beneath all of it, beneath the ravages of time and neglect, his father was still there, still alive, still his. "You look terrible," Nathan said, and then he laughed. It was a wet, broken sound, but it was a laugh nonetheless. The first one either of them had shared in 6 years. Elias's mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile. "You always did have your mother's honesty." The mention of Margaret hung in the air between them, no longer a wound but a bridge. She had known. She had prepared. Even in death, she had found a way to bring them back together. Colonel Vaughn approached slowly, giving them space but clearly needing to address the situation. "Captain Thorne," she said gently. "Master Sergeant, we have a private room upstairs if you would like to continue your conversation away from the crowd." Nathan looked around as if seeing the lobby for the first time. The soldiers lining the walls. The civilians clustered near the exits. The phones held at respectful distances, recording history. He had been so focused on his father that he had forgotten they had an audience. "That might be best," Nathan said. He turned back to Elias. "Can you walk, Dad?" Elias nodded slowly. He released the coffee cup he had been holding for hours, setting it on the bench beside him. Then, with Nathan's hand under his elbow, he rose to his feet. The lobby snapped to attention. Every soldier present, from a young private at the security desk to the grizzled sergeant major who had served 3 combat tours, came to attention simultaneously. The sound of boots clicking together echoed off the marble walls. Hands rose in salute. Elias froze. His breath caught in his throat. He had not been saluted like this since 1968, since the ceremony at the White House, since a president had placed a medal around his neck that he never felt he deserved. Colonel Vaughn's voice rang out across the lobby. "For Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, Medal of Honor, Battle of Dak II, November 1967. The salutes held. No one moved. No one breathed. Elias's hand trembled as it rose to his brow. The motion was rusty, unpracticed, but the muscle memory was still there. 57 years since he had last returned to salute in earnest, but his body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. He held the salute for a long moment, his eyes moving across the faces of the soldiers before him. Young faces, old faces, faces that had seen combat and faces that had only trained for it. All of them united in this moment, honoring a man who had given everything and asked for nothing. When he finally lowered his hand, the soldiers followed. The attention broke, but the reverence remained. Sergeant Major Chun stepped forward. He had been standing nearby throughout the reunion, giving father and son their space, but now he approached with purpose. In his hands, he held the photograph. The same photograph he had carried for 57 years. "Master Sergeant," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I would be honored if you would sign this. Not for me, for my grandchildren, so they will know who saved their grandfather's life." Elias looked at the photograph. Two young soldiers, covered in dirt and blood, standing in front of a helicopter. One of them was him. The other was the gut-shot private he had carried off a hill in Vietnam. The date written on the back in faded ink. November 1967. He reached out and took the photograph with trembling hands. Chun produced a pen. Elias hesitated, then wrote in careful script beneath the image. "To the Chun family. Semper Fi. Elias Thorne." It was not much. A few words. A signature. But Chun received it like it was made of gold. His eyes glistened as he looked at the inscription. "Thank you, Sergeant." His voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you for everything." Elias shook his head. "You carried yourself off that hill, Private. I just showed you the way." Chun laughed, a wet and broken sound. "Still the same. After all these years, still deflecting. You never could accept what you did, could you? I did what any soldier would have done." "No." Chun's voice was firm. "You did what no soldier should have had to do. And you did it alone. For 19 hours. That is not normal, Sergeant. That is not just duty. That is something else entirely." The words settled over the lobby like a blanket. Nathan stood beside his father, listening, learning details about the man he thought he knew. He had grown up hearing stories about his father's service, but they had always been vague, sanitized, stripped of the horror and heroism that made them real. Now, standing in a building named for his father, surrounded by soldiers who knew the legend, he was finally beginning to understand. Colonel Vaughn gestured toward the elevator. "This way, Master Sergeant." "Captain, we have a room prepared." Nathan guided his father forward, one hand still on his elbow, unwilling to break contact even for a moment. They walked through the corridor of soldiers, past the salutes and the tear-streaked faces, past the young MP who had first recognized the resemblance to the portrait. As they passed the security desk, Elias paused. His eyes had found the portrait on the wall behind it. A young man in dress uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, eyes bright with a future he could not imagine. A man who had not yet watched 17 boys die, who had not yet held David Leong as he bled out, who had not yet learned what surviving could cost. Elias stared at the portrait for a long moment. Then he turned to his son. "I do not know that man anymore," he said quietly. "I'm not sure I ever did." Nathan squeezed his arm. "You do not have to be that man, Dad. You just have to be my father. That is enough. That has always been enough." The elevator doors opened. Father and son stepped inside together. The doors closed behind them. And in the lobby below, the soldiers remained at their posts, bearing witness to the night the hero came home. The room on the second floor had been a conference space, but someone had transformed it in the hours since Vaughn's first phone call. A couch had been brought in from somewhere, along with blankets and pillows. A table held sandwiches and bottled water and fresh coffee. The overhead lights had been dimmed in favor of lamps that cast warm shadows across the walls. It looked less like a military facility and more like a home. Nathan guided his father to the couch and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither of them seemed willing to let the other out of reach. Colonel Vaughn stood near the door, giving them privacy while remaining available if needed. Chun had followed them up, unwilling to leave the man who had saved his life, but he stayed back near the window, a silent guardian. Elias looked around the room, taking in the careful preparations. Someone had put thought into this. Someone had wanted him to feel welcome, comfortable, safe. The gestures were small, but they landed with unexpected force. After 6 years of being invisible, of being moved along and looked through, the simple act of being cared for felt almost overwhelming. "When did you eat last?" Nathan asked. His voice carried the practical concern of a son who had inherited his mother's instinct for caretaking. Elias tried to remember. The shelter had served breakfast yesterday. Or was it the day before? Time had become fluid over the years, measured not in hours, but in distances walked, in temperatures endured, in nights survived. "I do not remember," he admitted. Nathan reached for the sandwiches without another word. He unwrapped one and placed it in his father's hands, watching to make sure Elias actually took a bite before allowing himself to relax slightly. The food was simple, turkey and cheese on white bread. But to Elias, it tasted like a feast. He ate slowly, methodically, the way he had learned to eat in the field when calories were precious and you never knew when the next meal would come. Colonel Vaughn cleared her throat softly. "Master Sergeant, I need to inform you of some administrative matters. Nothing urgent, but things you should know." Elias looked up, chewing carefully. "Go ahead, Colonel. First, your military records are intact. Your service history, your commendations, your Medal of Honor status. Nothing has been lost or compromised despite your years of—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Despite your time away." The phrasing was diplomatic. Elias appreciated that. She could have said homelessness, could have said vagrancy. Instead, she had chosen words that preserved his dignity. "Second," Vaughn continued, "you are entitled to full veterans' benefits. Medical care, housing assistance, pension payments that have been accumulating in an account in your name. The VA has been trying to locate you for years to distribute these funds." Elias blinked. He had not thought about benefits in a long time, had assumed that by walking away from everything, he had forfeited his right to such things. The idea that the system had been searching for him, that money had been set aside in his name, was difficult to process. "How much?" Nathan asked the question his father could not. Vaughn glanced at a folder in her hands. "Approximately $240,000, Captain. 6 years of pension payments plus interest." The number hung in the air. Elias stared at the sandwich in his hands, at the turkey and cheese that had cost someone a few dollars at most. He had spent 6 years sleeping under bridges while $250,000 waited for him in an account he had never accessed. The absurdity of it hit him like a wave. He had been so determined to punish himself, so convinced that he deserved nothing, that he had walked away from everything. And the whole time, his country had been trying to take care of him. "There is something else," Vaughn said. She hesitated, glancing at Nathan before continuing. "Lieutenant Ashworth, the officer who confronted you in the lobby. I want you to know that there will be consequences for his behavior." Elias set down the sandwich. "What kind of consequences?" "At minimum, a formal reprimand in his permanent record, possibly reassignment. His conduct was inexcusable, regardless of who you turn out to be. Every veteran deserves to be treated with dignity." Elias was quiet for a long moment. He thought about Ashworth, about the young man's polished uniform and aggressive posture, about the contempt in his voice when he had demanded that Elias leave. He thought about all the times he had been treated the same way by people who saw only the surface, only the dirt and the rags and the white beard. He was doing his job, Elias said finally. He saw a vagrant in his building, and he responded according to his training. "I do not want his career destroyed because of me." Vaughn frowned. "Master Sergeant," with respect, he tried to arrest a Medal of Honor recipient for seeking shelter from a life-threatening storm. "He did not know who I was. No one did. That is the point." Elias's voice was calm but firm. "If you punish him too harshly, he will learn the wrong lesson. He will learn to be careful about who he mistreats, not to stop mistreating people altogether. A reprimand is enough. Let him carry the weight of what he did. That will teach him more than a court-martial ever could." The room fell silent. Nathan stared at his father with something approaching awe. After everything Ashworth had done, After the public humiliation and the threats and the grabbed arm, Elias was advocating for mercy. Chun stepped forward from his position near the window. "That," he said quietly, "is why you held that hill alone. That is why we followed you into hell and back. Because you always thought about what was right, not what felt good." Elias shook his head. "I'm just tired. Too tired for anger. Too tired for revenge. I spent 57 years being angry at myself. I do not have any left for a young lieutenant who made a mistake." Nathan reached out and took his father's hand. The gesture was simple, instinctive, the kind of touch that had been absent from Elias's life for 6 years. "Dad," he said softly, "we should talk about what happens next." Elias looked at his son. The fear that had been lurking beneath the surface finally rose to the top. What happens next? The question he had been avoiding since the moment he agreed to let Vaughn make the phone call. "I do not know if I could go back to the house," he admitted. "Too many memories. Too much of her." Nathan squeezed his hand. "Then do not. I have a place in North Carolina. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a yard that needs work. Plenty of room for 2. You would want me there? After everything?" Nathan's answer was immediate. "I have wanted you there for 6 years, Dad. The room has been ready since the day you left. I never gave up. Mom told me not to give up." Elias felt the tears coming again. He had thought he was empty, but the breakdown in the lobby had drained everything he had. But there was more. There was always more. "She knew," he whispered. "She always knew. She loved you," Nathan said. "We both did. We both do. That never changed. That never will." And in that small room on the 2nd floor of Thorn Hall, surrounded by people who saw him not as a vagrant, but as a father, a hero, a man worth saving, Elias Thorn finally allowed himself to believe that coming home was possible. The night stretched toward dawn. Nathan refused to leave his father's side, and Elias found that he did not want him to. They talked in fits and starts, sometimes for long stretches and sometimes in comfortable silence. The years of separation could not be bridged in a single night, but they could begin. Nathan told his father about his life, about the cases he had tried, the soldiers he had defended, the justice system he had learned to navigate, about meeting his wife Rachel at a JAG conference in San Diego, about her patience and understanding when he explained that his father was missing and that finding him had become his life's mission, about the way she had never once suggested he give up, had never once complained about the money spent on investigators or the nights spent searching databases. "She sounds like your mother," Elias said. Nathan smiled. "She is. That is why I married her." Elias learned that he had a daughter-in-law he had never met, a woman who had married into his family knowing that part of it was broken, and who had spent 4 years helping Nathan search anyway. The kindness of strangers extended through love of his son. There were harder conversations, too. Nathan asked about the years on the street, and Elias answered as honestly as he could. The shelters that were full, the nights that were cold, the other veterans he had met along the way, men and women who had served their country and then been forgotten by it. He did not romanticize the experience, but he did not wallow in it either. It was simply what had happened, the consequences of choices he had made. "Did you ever think about coming back?" Nathan asked. "Every day." Elias's voice was hoarse. "Every single day. I would find a payphone and dial the first 6 digits of your number and then hang up. I would walk past bus stations and look at the schedules to North Carolina. Once I made it as far as the ticket counter before I turned around. What stopped you?" "Fear." The word came out heavy with shame. "I was afraid of what you would see when you looked at me. Afraid that I had become someone you could not love anymore. Afraid that coming back would only make things worse." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice steady. "Do you know what I saw when I walked into that lobby tonight?" Elias shook his head. "I saw my father." Nathan's hand found his. Not a vagrant, not a failure, not a disappointment. My father, the man who taught me to ride a bike, the man who stayed up all night helping me with my history project, the man who held my mother's hand every single day of her illness and never once let her see him cry. The tears came again, silent this time, tracking down Elias's weathered cheeks. He had spent 6 years convinced that his son would be better off without him, that his presence was a burden, his existence a reminder of everything that had been lost. He had been wrong. He had been so terribly wrong. I wasted so much time, he whispered. Then let us not waste any more. Nathan's grip tightened. Come home, Dad. Not to the old house. Not to the memories. Just home. With me. The word hung in the air between them. Home. It had been an abstract concept for so long, a place that existed only in memory, that hearing it spoken as an invitation felt almost foreign. But Nathan was offering it freely, without conditions, without judgment. Just come home. There was a knock at the door. Colonel Vaughn entered, her face soft in the lamplight. Master Sergeant. Captain, I want to let you know that the sun will be up in about an hour. There's a transport heading to Fort Bragg at 0800 if you would like to take it. Nathan looked at his father. Dad? Elias thought about the street, about the cold that waited outside, about the bridges and the shelters and the endless walking that led nowhere. He thought about Margaret, about her final words, about the promise she had extracted from their son. Let someone carry you now. He had been carried tonight by Chun, who had recognized him across 57 years, by Vaughn, who had treated him with dignity from the moment she arrived, by Nathan, who had flown through a storm to find him, by soldiers he had never met who had saluted him like he still mattered. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to let himself be carried all the way home. Yes, Elias said. The word came out rough, uncertain, like a language he was relearning. Yes, I would like that. Nathan's face broke into a smile that looked so much like Margaret's that Elias felt his heart crack open all over again. He pulled out his phone. Rachel, he said when the call connected. His voice was thick with emotion. I found him. We're coming home. Elias could hear a woman's voice on the other end, the words indistinct but the tone unmistakable. Joy. Relief. Welcome. She says she is making up the guest room, Nathan reported, and that she expects you to eat a real breakfast when we get there. No arguments. Yes, ma'am, Elias said, the response automatic, the military formality natural even now. Nathan laughed. You have not even met her, and you're already following orders. She's going to love you. The room felt warmer somehow, smaller, but in a good way. The walls that had seemed institutional when they first entered now felt protective, sheltering. Outside, the freezing rain had stopped. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to seep through the windows. Sergeant Major Chun stepped forward. He had remained in the room throughout the night, a quiet presence in the corner, unwilling to leave the man who had saved his life. Now he approached the couch where father and son sat together. Master Sergeant, he said, before you go, I want you to know something. Elias looked up at him. I have lived a good life. Chin's voice was steady, but his eyes glistened. I have a wife who has put up with me for 48 years. 3 children who turn out better than I deserved. 7 grandchildren who think I hung the moon. And all of it, every single moment of it, exists because you carried me off that hill. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a challenge coin. It was old, worn smooth by decades of handling, the insignia of the 173rd Airborne barely visible on its surface. I have carried this since Vietnam, Chin said. It was supposed to go in my coffin with me, but I want you to have it, so you remember that the 143 lives you saved became thousands. Families, children, grandchildren, legacies that would not exist without you. He pressed the coin into Elias's palm and closed his fingers around it. You're not just a survivor, Sergeant. You are a beginning. We all are because of you. Elias looked down at the coin in his hand. Worn and old and precious. A physical reminder of lives lived because he had refused to leave anyone behind. He closed his fist around it and held it against his chest. Thank you, Private, he said softly. Chin smiled through his tears. Sergeant Major now. You have been gone a while. Elias almost laughed. It was a strange sensation, rusty and unfamiliar, but it felt good. It felt like something waking up after a long sleep. Sergeant Major, then he said, Thank you, Sergeant Major. And for the first time in 6 years, Elias Thorne believed that he might actually deserve to go home. 3 months later, spring had come to North Carolina. The dogwoods were blooming in Nathan's backyard, their white petals catching the afternoon light like snow that had forgotten to fall. Elias sat on the back porch, a cup of coffee warming his hands, watching the birds argue over the feeder Rachel had hung from the oak tree. He had gained weight. Not much, but enough that his clothes no longer hung from his frame like drapes on a skeleton. His beard was trimmed now, neat and white, and his hair had been cut by a barber who had not asked questions about where he had been or what he had done. The haunted look had not entirely left his eyes, but it had softened. Some days, when the light was right, he almost looked like the man in the old photographs. The back door opened, and Rachel stepped onto the porch, carrying a plate of sandwiches. She was a small woman with kind eyes and a practical manner, exactly the type of person Nathan would have chosen. She set the plate on the table beside Elias and settled into the chair across from him. "You have a visitor coming," she said. Nathan called from the office. "You should be here in about an hour." Elias raised an eyebrow. He had learned not to be surprised by visitors anymore. In the 3 months since his return, a steady stream of people had found their way to Nathan's door. Veterans who had served with him, families of the men he had saved, journalists who wanted to tell his story. He had turned away the journalists, but the others he welcomed. Each face was a reminder that the lives he had saved had continued, had multiplied, had become something larger than the sum of their parts. "Who is it this time?" Rachel smiled. "Someone from the VA. They want to talk about a new program they're starting. Peer counseling for homeless veterans. They want your input." Elias considered this. The VA had been attentive since his return, almost embarrassingly so. They had assigned him a caseworker who actually returned phone calls, a therapist who did not flinch when he talked about the things he had seen, a primary care physician who treated him like a person rather than a number. It was more support than he had ever expected, more than he sometimes felt he deserved. But he was learning to accept it, slowly, reluctantly, with Margaret's voice in his head reminding him that surviving was not a betrayal. The weekly sessions with the therapist had been the hardest part, talking about Dak too, about David Leong, about the 17 names tattooed on his arm and the weight they had carried for 57 years. Some sessions ended with him unable to speak, tears streaming down his face while the therapist waited patiently. Others ended with something approaching peace, a momentary lightness that felt foreign but not unwelcome. He had started attending a support group at the local VA hospital. Other veterans, other survivors, other men and women who carried invisible wounds that never fully healed. At first, he had only listened, had sat in the back of the room and let their stories wash over him. But eventually, hesitantly, he had begun to share his own. "My name is Elias. I was a master sergeant in the 173rd Airborne, and I spent 6 years homeless because I could not forgive myself for surviving." The words had been harder to say than anything he had ever done in combat, but they had also been necessary. The first step on a road he was still learning to walk. Nathan came home early that afternoon, just before the VA representative arrived. He found his father on the porch, staring at the dogwoods, the empty plate of sandwiches beside him. "You ate," Nathan observed. "Good." Rachel was worried you would forget again. Elias smiled. "Your wife is very persistent. She learned from the best." Nathan settled into the chair Rachel had vacated. "Dad, before this meeting, there is something I want to tell you." Elias waited. "The building at Fort Hamilton, Thorn Hall. They are adding a new display to the lobby. The story of what happened that night, how you came in from the cold, how Sergeant Major Chun recognized you. They want to include it in the tour they give to new soldiers." Nathan paused. "They want your permission." Elias was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the lobby, about the marble floors and the bronze plaque and the portrait of a young man he no longer recognized. He thought about Lieutenant Ashworth, who had been transferred to a training command in Kansas and who had, according to Vaughn, become a vocal advocate for treating all veterans with dignity regardless of appearance. He thought about the soldiers who would walk through that lobby in years to come, young men and women who would see his face on the wall and hear the story of a Medal of Honor recipient who had ended up homeless, who had been almost thrown out of the building named for him, who had been saved by recognition and reunion. "If it helps one person," he said finally, "if one soldier sees that display and treats a homeless veteran differently because of it, then yes, they have my permission." Nathan nodded. He had expected nothing less. The VA representative arrived at 3 o'clock. A woman in her 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had served. She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chun, no relation to the sergeant major, and explained the program she was developing. Peer counselors drawn from the homeless veteran population. People who had lived on the streets, who understood the reality of it, trained to help others find their way back. "We need people like you," she said. "Not to fix anyone, just to show them that coming back is possible." Elias listened. He asked questions. He thought about the men and women he had met during his years on the street. The ones who were still out there, still sleeping under bridges, still believing that they had been forgotten. "I will do it," he said, "on one condition. Name it. I want to work with the ones everyone else has given up on. The ones who have been homeless the longest. The ones who think there is no way back." He met her eyes. "I was one of them. I know what it takes to reach them." Dr. Chun smiled. "That is exactly what we were hoping you would say." After she left, Elias remained on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the tree-line. Nathan had gone inside to help Rachel with dinner. The house was warm behind him, filled with the sounds of family, of life, of home. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Chin's challenge coin, worn smooth by decades, carried through a lifetime, passed on as a reminder of what one life could mean. 143 lives saved at DAC 2. Thousands more born from those lives in the decades since. And now, maybe a few more pulled back from the edge by a man who had been there himself. Elias closed his fist around the coin and held it against his chest. "Still here, brother," he whispered to the fading light. To David Leong. To the 17. To Margaret. Still trying. The back door opened. Nathan's voice called out, "Dad, dinner is ready." Elias rose from his chair. His joints ached and his back protested, but he was standing. He was alive. He was home. "Coming," he called back. And Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, Medal of Honor, survivor, father, walked into the warm light of his son's kitchen to share a meal with his family. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes do not always wear their medals, that courage sometimes looks like an old man in a worn field jacket seeking shelter from the cold, please consider subscribing to our channel. Share in the comments. Who is the quiet hero in your life? Who is the person whose sacrifices often go unnoticed? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones in uniform. They're the ones who carry their battles silently, waiting for someone to recognize what they have given. Thank you for watching.